Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to the latest episode of our Navigating Turbulent Times webinar, the second that we've done in our series so far. My name is Chris Moriarty. I'm Director of Insight and Engagement at IWFM, and I will be chairing today's session. I'll shortly introduce our panel, but first I'd just like to give us some scene setting. You don't need me to repeat the unprecedented times line. Our usual practices have been turned on their head. New ways of doing things have emerged in a matter of weeks. So whilst these circumstances are challenging, I think it's also fair to say that there are some positives coming from it that we can all consider and learn from. But one thing that we desperately need to do is to help each other as we navigate our way through. This also includes knowledge, and that's what today is all about. Today's webinar is dedicated specifically to that. To the conversation will be guided by yourselves and your questions. So as we go through today, you will be shaping this conversation. We've pulled together a stellar cast with expertise in service delivery, workplace design, supporting workforces, and maintaining buildings, and everything else in between. And what we'll do as a group, we'll endeavour to provide you with the best insight and expertise that we can. So just to introduce our panel very quickly, there we go, there's a picture of me for those of you that like to know what my face looks like. Right, so our panel. So first off, we have Simone Fenton-Jarvis. So Simone is a workplace consultancy director at Rico and has over 13 years experience in FM and workplace. Simone believes in organisations needs to put its people first, and it's belief that has driven her initiatives and work within the industry. She's an advocate for lifelong learning, has completed an MBA in FM, is a keen reader and a regular attendee at events, a fellow of the Institute and vice chair of the Workspace Special Interest Group. Jean Hewitt is a long-standing member with IWFM and has now specialised in accessibility and inclusion for 20 years. She is the author of IWFM's Good Practice Guide on the subject and represents IWFM on 2 British Standard Institution committees. She's an inclusive design consultant at Bureau Happold and has, as well as part-time lecturer at UCL, with a keen interest in neurodiversity and mental well-being, and I suspect that will be a topic that comes up throughout this debate. Andrew Holbert has an experience that spans across all service lines, both managed and self-delivered in the UK and Europe, as well as extensive experience in law, investment banking, retail management, managing agent, media, hotels, TV studios, and ICT sectors, and that's a lot to get in there. He founded Pareto Facilities Management in 2014 to create the most customer service focused FM provider in the UK. And it's gone on to become one of the fastest growing FM service providers within the sector. He has a master's in facility and environment management from UCL and is a regular volunteer with IWFM. And last and not least, Steve Tompkins. Steve is a chartered engineer with over 20 years experience in engineering, maintenance and management experience, working in facilities management, construction and rail automotive services, having worked in both small and multinational organisations delivering complex projects and solutions. Steve joined BESA to spearhead the ongoing development of SGF 20, the industry's recognised standard for maintenance specifications. And my job in all of this is to navigate us through this debate. So everyone apart from me and the panelists are on mute. And to submit your questions, you want to look into your control panel and open your questions box, and they'll come through to me and the organisers, and I'll be picking out as many of those as I can and putting them to the panel. For your information as well, this webinar will be recorded and hosted on our website in the next couple of days. So it's a slightly new format for us, so just bear with us as we go through all this. There might be a couple of pauses as panelists desperately try to find the mute button so they can speak, which is probably a regular feature of most of the meetings that we've been in at the moment, and even some television interviews that I've seen. But like I say, we'll keep it as lively as we can. We've got just under an hour now, and we'll see how we get on. So we've had some questions in advance. So when the email came out for registration, some people put some questions through. And I think I want to start with one that I suspect came to the fore in recent days with the announcement of the extension to the lockdown. So this is a question from Mark Allen, who has asked us that during the lockdown, the first initial 3 weeks, I think there was a kind of a prevailing sense that, let's just see how, sort of let's muddle through this for 3 weeks and then see where we get to, particularly when it comes to the home working environment, the sort of DSE considerations through all this. But with the announcement of an extension, an additional 3 weeks, which has kind of taken us, with the little delay that they had between the end of the first 3 week period and the extension, it's the best part of 2 months that we'll be working from home. And that probably means that we need to do a little bit more thinking about the DSE considerations and home working things. And Jean, I just hope that we could start with you in terms of your input from a design point of view. Is, what should people be thinking about now when they're thinking about the work settings that people are in, and some of those considerations, both physically, and I suspect you'd probably want to talk about some of the mental well-being aspects of that as well.
I certainly would. So it's very difficult because everybody's circumstances are entirely different. So some people are trying to balance home working with homeschooling and got a very busy household, and other people are more isolated. Some are in sort of sitting on the edge of a bed, and others may be using the whole dining room, and all different levels of comfort there. So lots and lots to think about. I think some people, because of their circumstances, have taken to it very well, and others have had to work much harder to try and get anything near what we would consider to be a comfortable environment. And there have been all sorts of issues that I've been watching on the internet about this. So just an example at Bureau Happel, where we were homeworking, a lot of people homeworked already on occasions, and some people have been forced to do it for the first time. So we're researching amongst our own workforce, which is international, to see how people are accommodating this new way of working, even though it's enforced, in their home working environment, and what they can do to make it better. So we've been doing a lot about sending out coffee mornings, chats, keeping connected. I think that's a really, really important factor in our mental well-being, is that we feel well connected and supported. But also in the environment itself, trying to create a personal space within which to work, and to find some way of defining work versus home life. Can be quite a challenge. So if you're using your dining room table, for example, you may feel like you're at work all the time because you're at the same table all day. So it's about trying to reinvent some boundaries, perhaps sometimes in an artificial way with a particular clock or what you're wearing. So lots and lots of people have said, oh, it's good to get up and dress as though you're going to work, even though nobody can see you. That's quite a good idea because it puts you in work mode, and I think that's a good place to start. But I think the answer is that we don't really know the answers, but I think trying to make sure that at least your chair is reasonably comfortable ergonomically, and that you've got a reasonable setup. There's been issues around some people getting bigger screens and things like that, which they may be used to. They might be confined to a small tablet or laptop. So an awful lot to think about, but I'll stop there, and perhaps we can come back to mental health and well-being, and how different types of people will adjust better to this than others. Some of us are very extrovert and want to be around lots of people, and others will work very, very well and find it actually easier to work at home at times. But I'll stop there and see what our audience has to say about this.
Well, I think that's an interesting area that you've touched on. Simone, I'd like to bring you into this if I can, because one thing that struck me there as Jean was talking about some of the considerations. Obviously the questions come from a physical bit, and there are some physical elements. There has been reports of increased cases of backache and things like that, because clearly people are working in furniture that wasn't designed for work. But I wonder, from your point of view, where do you see the role of, using one of your previous job titles, the Chief Workplace Officer, where do you see that role starting and stopping? Because clearly, I think traditional FM might, be very focused on the DSE part of it, but equally, Jean's touched on a few things about ways of working, some tips on how to set yourself up for work that might be a mixture of the environment and the circumstances you're in, as much as it is about the physical settings.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I guess with my previous role, I did oversee the wellbeing and closely kind of tied in with HR. And I think it's this overlap between facilities, IT, and HR that I guess is really getting tested right now. And I think, if I was in my previous role now, it'd be obviously really interesting to see how that would be navigated right now. But I think it's making sure that there is that alignment between them three areas. Because I think ultimately, from the chief workplace officer role, my role would have been seeing it right from DSE to IT connection, right through to, from a well-being point of view, how are people coping with this massive change? Things from not just the ergonomics, but are people in the habit of making sure that they're still getting up in the morning and getting dressed? Even having a shower and putting clothes on, it makes a massive difference to the productivity of your day. And I think, there's a lot of jokes around people being in, jammer bottoms with shirts on. But actually, in all seriousness, I've, even got to the extent of making sure that I'm putting like trainers on now because I want to feel like I'm at work, not sat in my slippers. And I just think that, people need to get in that habit of getting the structure right. But it is up to facilities ultimately to, advise and assist people and to support where people need that guidance around their work styles, because this is a massive change. And I think for those that have been working at home intermittently over the last few years, it'll just be kind of an extension of that. But there are so many people right now that are working at home that have just never worked at home before, and I think it's them that need the extra support right now.
Yeah, exactly that. And Andrew, I guess your viewpoint would be quite interesting as an employer, right? So, Pareto has a workforce. How are you, as an employer, how are you managing some of the things that we've touched on?
Yeah, I think what we've been doing is really proactively trying to engage with the staff on a regular basis. So we've been running calls at 2 o'clock every afternoon, which everyone's invited to, talking through different specialisms and different subjects. I think Pareto has always been very heavily involved in terms of engagement with its staff. So at this particular time, when we're used to spending lots of time with each other and engaging a lot with each other, you just have to find new ways to try and do that. Specifically, what we've done is with a couple of our clients is gone to the areas of expertise that we have within our business, initially around business level stuff, but sometimes on more personal stuff like fitness and well-being and health and things, and then run seminars and get people involved in that and then engage with them that way. Absolutely making sure that our management team and senior management team are available so that we can engage with people as and when we need to. Just because we're sat at home doesn't mean that there isn't any stop in terms of that engagement piece and being available. For me, the biggest challenge in this for a lot of people is the mental health aspect, which Jean mentioned earlier on. Someone like myself, for people that know me, I am an extrovert. I like to be out there with people. And actually around this sort of time, just need to make sure you're staying connected and making sure it feels like you're achieving things during this time. We've done a lot of work around social value and some stuff for charity and things like going back and auditing yourself on different sites and things, just to try and be proactive. I was talking to one member of staff who said that who's still working, and they were saying they finally got round to doing all those tasks that they've never been able to do before, and that's given them a great sense of well-being at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit that there is that sort of sense home working is the time to get all the stuff done. I'm yet to experience that yet. I seem to be in back-to-back team calls at the moment. But so yes, that's given us a bit of a rounded view of some of the considerations as a workforce shifts from one setting to the other. But meanwhile, and Steve, this is where I'd like to bring yourself in, because Steve, we brought you into this panel with a particular, in response to a lot of the questions that we had actually from our last webinar, which is this growing sense that there's a major problem developing with all these buildings now that are unoccupied, and particularly with the extension of that lockdown, that's now going to go on for an extended period of time. I guess just to start with, because there's a lot of very detailed technical questions in around that, but just as a sort of to start us off from a general overview point of view, what is it that you're seeing through your conversations and your work that are the major things that people need to start thinking about with these unoccupied buildings?
Afternoon, everybody. I think the main sort of responses that we initially sort of saw and inquiries were coming in were generally maintenance teams not being allowed access to buildings and being said the building was basically closed down, and the client was saying, well, actually you can't gain access. And one of the key things that obviously needs to be stressed is during these times that obviously statutory and mandatory maintenance still is required to be performed. And that's the general case unless you alter the state in terms of that actual building, in terms of mothballing that particular maintenance activity or system within a building. So I think the key thing is obviously that the mandatory and statutory requirements are seen to be done within buildings, and then secondary you've got the other factors such as the security of the building, and also in relation to insurances around the building, making sure that maintenance and operations that sustain insurance premiums or insurance requirements are performed. The last thing you want to be is in a situation whereby you've not necessarily maintained a fire alarm a month later, and then subsequently there's a fire, and then you go to insurer, and the insurer will potentially turn around and say, actually, you're invalidated because you've not actually carried out the routine maintenance that would ensure that that system was working correctly. So there's a lot of different states as well we're seeing within the industry sector, depending on which particular sort of sector you're servicing. So obviously, I think more recently in news, we're seeing that public houses and areas that are potentially more social will potentially be closed for a longer period of time, whereas we've got offices which are working in a partial state in terms of they're semi-occupied, depending on the nature of the business. Specifically, if they're servicing government departments, they are now working and operating as they would previously, but imposing things like social distancing and making sure that those buildings have obviously remain safe and operational as a whole.
I guess that's the thing. I mean, the sort of first part of your answer there is looking at the what we need to do right now. And actually, I hadn't even considered some of the elements in there about, you know, the insurance requirements and all the rest of it. So that's certainly something I hadn't even considered. But there is also then this sort of turning of attention. You know, once some of those things are in place, that turning of attention to, okay, we're coming back into the building now, and we've had some questions around things like standing water, decontamination. You know, that is actually getting the building from a state where it is safe as it is unoccupied back to almost firing it back up again to let some people in. We don't know quite yet, you know, what that will look like. But, you know, have you got any sort of advice or guidance for people that might be starting to put a plan in place that says, okay, when we are able to, here's how we'll start her up again, you know?
Mm-hmm. In the first instance, obviously, it depends on how far you've gone with standing your building down. Depending on the nature of the systems, if you decided that some of the systems you're not going to actually operate and they've been drained down, then obviously it's a full reactivation, and that's a significant piece of work. If you've kept those systems on a tick over, maybe reduce them down. In the meantime, things like Legionella and so forth, you should be, where a building's been less occupied, you should be looking at obviously less frequently used outlets and flushing those more frequently. I think the problem that's potentially going to happen or occur is as buildings, or as we do come out of lockdown, buildings are going to struggle to reactivate if they've not sustained some kind of maintenance operation, because there'll be a requirement on resources to obviously to reactivate buildings. And given the fact that some of the industry sector could be suffering with illness at any point in time leading up to this, that there is going to be a significant draw on resources and availability of resources to reactivate buildings. So my recommendation, if you are semi-occupied and semi-operating buildings, is you sustain the level of maintenance that needs to be performed, so that actually when you come to reactivate buildings, you can reactivate your buildings quite quickly, moving them from what we call maybe a turn down state into a fully operational state.
And that's I guess where I want to go next with this, because there's this kind of perception that, you know, this turning back, and perhaps Andrew, I'll bring you in on this particular kind of consideration, is the fact that we are going to come back, and at some point we'll be coming back in, but the perceptions of the workforce coming back in are going to change. Now, I think Jean and Simone will also have a view on this, but from a service provider point of view, what have you guys started to think about in terms of saying, well, what does our service look like when organisations are ready to open the doors again? And how much of a headache is that in terms of managing a workforce? Because, as Steve has mentioned, you're going to have to tackle your own workforce and their availability, and if people are self-isolating because they've got symptoms, because that's likely to be a feature of the landscape. How is Pareto kind of approaching that at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think as with all scenarios, you need to have a good relationship with your customer to understand their workspace in terms of what they anticipate their requirements are going to be going back in. And from our perspective, we do a lot of engineering. About half of what we do is engineering, and actually we're using SFG 30, which is the new guidance that Steve and his team have just put out. And actually, we're already talking to customers about what engineering services may look like prior to going back in. Many of them are saying that actually maybe 2-3 weeks before the planned go live, we may look to bring a lot of engineering back in. What Pareto have done, we've created a central London workforce of engineers that are currently going around and just doing all of the statutory compliance things. Because as Steve alluded to, things like flushing now, all of a sudden, every single tap needs to be flushed in the building, not just the ones that were low usage before. So we're already engaging with our customers now. We had to have quite a lot of engagement around furloughing teams and reducing services. Now we're having the engagement around how do we ramp those services back up. But also, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of engagement with our team on a regular basis. And many of them, especially on the engineering side, are already aware that they're going to be needed. I would also just answer the question around sickness and things. We all of us in the service provider sector, what before lockdown happened, there was an awful lot of sickness and an awful lot of dealing with lockdown scenarios and things. And actually in self-isolation, clients were very accommodating of that because they had that themselves within their own teams as well. So it was about taking a very pragmatic approach. And this is the important time to have great relationships with your customers. And actually at this time, especially from Pareto's perspective, we have great engagement with them and we're working together to try and solve the solution. And I think that's probably what's good from an SME perspective in this sector too. So again, it's just about continued engagement. I think it's about being proactive and engaging with staff and clients now and starting to rebuild what that looks like. And on many clients, we have models that are looking at 30-day, 60-day, 90-day and 120-day scenarios in terms of that we can draw upon just to try and make sure we've got all aspects covered.
I mean, yeah, it's one of those scenarios where you're sort of dusting off your plans and looking at, in this circumstance, what do we do? And I think there's probably been more of them written in the last month or two than ever before.
I would just add to that many of our clients, and we work with some enormous brands, many of them don't consider in their business continuity procedures, they didn't consider the whole infrastructure of the UK closing down. Many business continuity procedures were about moving from building A to building B if there was ever a problem. And I think this has really forced customers to re-look at their premises and their business continuity scenarios and how many people can log in on their VPN and how good their webcam software is and video conferencing software is. It's forced a lot of questions to be asked in this scenario that weren't being asked before. And I think FM providers have had a great input into that around trying to assist their customers to be better ready for this type of thing in the future.
Well, that's a really good segue actually into a question I want to ask you, Simone, because there's a lot of questions coming in from people that are kind of thinking ahead at another stage. We're almost doing this chronologically at the minute. We've got everyone home, we're thinking about the empty building, we're starting to think about how we might turn that on. But there's a lot of people on the chat and in the questions that we've had previously saying, the world of work is going to be changed. There's going to be a step change in this, whether that's caused by sort of an opening and closing of the economy because we're still battling with the virus, or whether it's just that simply people have changed their behaviors. And the fact that there's a number of books that talk about habits setting in after 21 days, the fact that we're going to do nearly twice that in lockdown, we're going to have some fairly strong habits forming. And then we're suddenly going to, I don't think anyone's under the impression we're going to be able to just say, right, everyone back to what you were doing. So from a workforce point of view, Simone, what work have you been what have you been considering as some of the major things that we'll have to start thinking about in terms of the change of behaviours, the change of habits, the change of perceptions, because that's going to have an impact on how we respond, and to Andrew's point, some of the things that we'll have to change in partnership with our service providers and other teams to accommodate.
So I guess, it's like, I guess the thing that it reminds me of is, post Christmas, and I laugh every year when my father-in-law starts taking his car out for a drive on Boxing Day to make sure that it is still up and running. I get back to work after Christmas every year and go, oh, I'm really missing them afternoon naps. Why I need to, and the kind of chilled out time. And I think this is that, when we all go back to work, I think we're going to have a bit of a shock to the system if we all try and go back to work the way that we were working before. And I think, change is inevitable. It's, it's ongoing anyway. We're always in that constant state of change. But I think the way that we need to approach this is actually, from how we used to work before COVID and how we want to work in the future, we need to determine what that looks like for each other. I don't think we all need to go back to the way that we was working before. I think, some of the meetings even that I go to, I think actually could that be done by technology, and, and I work for a technology company. So I think it's just forming them new habits, and I think there'll be a lot of positive habits come out of it, but there'll also be probably some quite habits that may need a bit of an area for improvement. And I guess it's about just assessing them habits, and also, workplaces, it's about preparing the workforce, but also preparing the workplace. And I guess if you go back to the workforce bit, the change management and the strong communications that are going to be needed when people return to the workplace, because ultimately people are going to still be in, I guess, potentially a state of fear, anxiety. And it might not be just the workplace, but it might be the commute to work that is the thing that's stressing people out. People may start missing working from home. It might be a bit of a sensory overload for, an introvert potentially to go back straight into the workplace at full throttle. So I think, this phased return to work is going to be really key for people. And I think it's up to organisations now to show, a lot of compassion to their workforce and a lot of understanding, and just this kind of let them come back in their own time, and also phase that return for social distancing and safety purposes as well.
And Jean, that's going to be, from a design point of view, that's going to be a real challenge, right? Because a number of the questions that we've had come in are from people who are starting to think forward a few steps and go, well, look, maybe they've just invested heavily in creating a new open plan environment with lots of collaboration spaces and huddle spaces and all this sort of thing. But suddenly, even if we are allowed back into the workplace, even if we are allowed back in certain sort of numbers, there will be people who are naturally quite cautious about being in groups. It's going to throw some of the people and space ratios out if we're thinking that we need to give people, the kind of the maneuverability to have a 2-meter radius around them at all times. So there's a lot of things now to consider from a design point of view, and whether that's short term or long term, we don't know, because it might, trends sometimes come out of funny places. So from a design perspective, how are you guys looking at that? And have you had early conversations with clients who've been in touch to say, look, we're going to have to rethink this, or we're going to have to look at this a different way?
I think a lot of clients are already changing their perspective on this, and I think the whole enforced homeworking is a game changer, really, and it's making us all think again. Now, recognising that we might have a period now of, 18 months or so, where we might be confined to home and then let out and then confined to home again and so on. I think the flexibility in everything we do is key. And I think what clients are probably going to have to think about is how they can have the best of both worlds. So giving some control back to individuals, because after all, we're all unique. Some of us will thrive better in home working, and some of us will thrive better in an open plan, and some in a cellular office and so forth. So giving people choices. So those people that maybe have an underlying health condition or are worried about their own loved ones at home, or for some other reason are very anxious about the situation with COVID, may prefer to stay at home and work from there a little longer. And I think it needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. I think there are lots of people who have benefited from the home working benefits and see these readily as being, less travel. For myself, for example, I'm probably saving 2 to 3 hours a day, and that horrible journey into London, which is congested and everything. So I'm not looking forward to that. But I am a social being, so I do want that connectivity as well. So as a balance for someone like me, maybe 2 days in the office a week and 3 at home, and I prefer to travel off peak. So there will be a whole variety, and I think flexibility is key. Not every job, of course, allows that flexibility. So if you're in engineering or if you're in FM, typically you are in the workplace serving others, and you need to be in that building to do your job. But there are many others that are doing other sort of desk-based type work that don't need to be there all the time. And I think this has really forced us all to get to grips with remote working and the connectivity. She says, haven't had problems getting online today, but we've all had to step up to make sure that we've got that connectivity. And I think for most of us, it's working quite well. And I, for one, have been really, really surprised how you can have I had a BSI meeting, for example, with 28 people online that actually worked better than a face-to-face meeting. And you think, oh, and it saved travel time. So I think it's a game changer, but I think the workplace, when we design it in future, will have to have a lot of flexibility. So it's places that are maybe modular, that you can add cubicles to and take them away again, just as you would for sort of teams working for a particular project. It'll need to be a lot more flexible than it has been to date.
And I guess, sort of putting a previous hat of mine when I did some work out and sort of looking at the future of workplaces and what works and what doesn't. Are you worried as well, just to sort of add to that point, Jean, are you worried as well that there's been a lot of progress made in terms of giving real consideration to working environments? I think it's fair to say that organisations for a long time have sort of taken a fairly passive look at it. An office is an office, get the desks in there, get enough chairs in there, and then let people do the work. But over the last 5 or so years, there's been a real shift towards intelligent approaches to workplaces and some of the spaces that help work. But then you see, and this is anecdotal, but I saw a conversation on Twitter the other day with an organisation that said, look, scrap it all, we're going back to cubicles because social distancing is going to be the major thing, and we're going to have to keep everyone absolutely kind of segregated. And I just, when I saw that, I just kind of worried that it's almost like a knee-jerk back to what was an unproductive working environment for many.
It's very interesting. So, I mean, I'd hate to see the cubicles come back, but I do recognise that equally that we've got a lot of clients that have got pods. So they've got little pods around the edges of their open plan space, and there are lots of people that need those for other reasons. So, for example, I'm neurotypical, but a lot of people, 20% or so of the population are neurodivergent. They might have somewhere in the autistic spectrum or ADHD or dyslexia and so forth. And I don't want to generalize here, but there are lots of people who are neurodivergent and for other reasons might prefer that more cubicle, semi-enclosed type of workspace. And I think we need to allow for the fact that we're all different, and we should be able to choose the type of environment we're in. Maybe we can't always choose to be at home, but if we come to work, we could sort of book ourselves a workplace that works for us. And I think the idea of demountable and very agile type working is a really good idea anyway, and that's something that could be developed. I don't think the products are necessarily there at the moment to take up and put down, but from the exhibition industry, they must, I'm sure they could turn their hands to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, we've talked a little bit about, change as we go back into a new normal, and not necessarily wanting to add to the well-worn narrative that's going on. Lots of words keep getting saying, but the new normal, whatever that might be. But do you guys then look at the sort of standards as they are today? Do you think that we could expect to see some change in some of those standards around maintenance and buildings that perhaps have been influenced by whatever the new kind of status is moving forward?
I think what we will see a lot more in the future, and we've been working on this significantly and looking at this more in terms of development, is mixture of maintenance strategies and possibly more of a movement to condition-based maintenance based on utilisation of assets. I think there was an interesting report that sort of came out or was delivered by JLL in terms of where they see future assets utilisation after this COVID-19 event. And they did an online survey with a number of participants. I think it was a KPMG webinar, and there was a respondents that said that 50% saw that actually the way of working wouldn't be the same sort of going forward, which would have an impact on utilisation of estates and how those estates are used going forward. So yeah, I do see there will be a change. Primarily, the maintenance regimes that are in place and are used within the industry sector are very well established. The question will be more on actually if you do have smaller populations and you are potentially using buildings more as hubs, where your workforce are coming in and working for a period of time, doing a particular meeting or a particular session, and then subsequently coming away and working remotely again, it will have an impact in terms of the actual utilisation of the space and the space requirement.
So I guess if I'm hearing you right, there will be some standards, I guess, that work on an assumed usage of building, right? And up until recently, they were fairly accurate. No one could really imagine what we were about to see. So are you saying that it might be if we're going to be flexing? I sort of thinking about back to one of the things that Andrew said earlier on, where there's this business continuity plans that said, well, if we're in building A and something happens to it, we'll go to building B, but when you can't use building B either, then you have to change. It's almost a similar thing in the sense that, this standard has kind of been designed with this in mind, but actually we'd never anticipated usage in this way. Therefore, actually, we might have to adjust the application of these standards, if not the standard themselves.
I think it's a mixture. I think the standards that are in place at the moment, for instance, SFG 20 is a planned preventative maintenance standard. That standard potentially will continue in its current guise, but you'll probably reduce an estate and have less facilities used because actually you will flex your utilisation. But maybe on smaller buildings, you might be able to look more closely at actually the utilisation of the spaces in the buildings and start applying more measures in terms of looking at building management system to record how that building is used, Internet of Things sort of feeding in and telling you how spaces are being used, how people are coming into the building, when people are going out of the building. And this would potentially give you more of a view in terms of how to optimize your maintenance around those particular aspects. There will still be planned preventative maintenance, but there will be an element of condition management where you potentially then would overlay and move more into a predictive maintenance regime. And with the technology that's been developed pre-COVID-19, we are seeing a lot more in terms of predictive maintenance and monitoring pieces of equipment. And with personnel working remotely, they'll want more of an insight in terms of what's actually happening with their assets. And I can see this technology becoming more prolific. But unless you physically completely redesign your equipment to have no maintenance intervention, there is always going to be a requirement at some point, to a certain extent, to have somebody physically replace that, or it may even be in the future that you might have some kind of technology that's able to do that.
Great. Andrew, just there's a few questions coming through at the moment that seem to be all gravitating around, with what we talked about already about this sort of new set of work. What does it look like? What does usage look like, and all the rest of it? But of course, we'll be putting your organisation will be putting people into working environments, other people's working environments, but they'll have to observe any new rules that we've got around social distancing, or particularly in the short term, if we're allowed out of our houses again, there might be some stipulations with that says, if you are going to go back out, then here are some things you need to abide by. I mean, from a public point of view, an example would be the idea of maybe if you're using public transport, you might have to wear a face mask. So there's going to be the equivalent of that in the working environment, and particularly with your workforce going into organisations. And the questions seem to be around two sort of, I would say that they're gravitating around two areas of service. One is catering, and how much catering will have to change. And the other is around cleaning regimes, particularly with, I suspect, a workforce coming back in who might have a heightened perception of what they consider to be a clean environment, given that we've been scrubbing ourselves with alcohol gel for the last two and a bit months. So how, from a service provider point of view, how much do you know of what you might have to change, and how are you approaching it? What are the sort of things that are occupying your thinking and your team's thinking at the minute? And once we're allowed back in, what will have to change from day one to sort of observe some of those social distancing things that we might need to become quite used to?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing some of that. Many of our clients' premises are not closed at this stage. So one of the fundamentals that we've done is risk assessments. So all of the service providers on this call will know that all staff need risk assessments for the tasks that they complete. And actually, we've written specific risk assessments and safe systems of work for how people should operate within these premises right now. And I see a version of that being implemented in the new scenario. We're also seeing with our supplier base, with suppliers that are coming to sites for things like fire alarm maintenance, for example, they're asking a series of questions prior to coming into that building. So things like, has anybody with COVID-19 been in there in the last 2 weeks? What measures are you taking as a site? So we're already seeing that start to come to fruition at this stage. And actually, again, it's about being proactive. So service providers right now should be writing those risk assessments and considering what sort of questions they'll need. And also for those providers that are much larger, that say have 25,000 plus members of staff, how do you easily get to all of those members of staff to make sure that that word is spread and that the risk is managed right for all? I think the government will provide more information to us as we go through, but certainly some of my client base that I operate with at the moment, they are looking at reduced usage of the office until December this year. Now, whether that means, sitting people every other desk so that there's some space left inside, but also on things like cleaning, I think actually there'll be much more of a focus around those high density areas. So things like door handles and reception areas and lift buttons and all that sort of thing. But also FM has a really good opportunity here to actually increase its perception from the leadership perspective, because the board is going to be looking to FM right now to actually implement all of this, because we are the ones that can make the difference and make it safe within the space that we have. And actually to get recognised at that board level is one of the most exciting opportunities that FM has at this stage, as well as the challenge of being seen as one of the biggest costs to an organisation. And certainly because income will be down for the majority of customers in this scenario, there's going to be this real fine balance between being the heroes that are going to fix everything and being the ones that are being beaten up to try and have cost savings added at the same time. So yeah, to summarise, being proactive with things like risk assessments and actually having those senior-based conversations quite quickly to make sure we understand how this new space is going to work. And again, that comes down to great engagement with customers.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Actually, and that's I'm going to use that as a springboard into a question for you, Simone, because Andrew talked about there that organisations have been faced with a big challenge, and for the industry there is this great opportunity to position itself as historically a part of the business landscape that was beaten up quite regularly, particularly on cost, to actually being a bit of a hero here and say, we can get you operational again, we can get you back up and running again safely, let's work together on this. But a few of the questions that are coming in as well are about how organizations rethink their agile working strategies, their flexible, whatever we want to call them, but working in different ways. And I wonder whether in hand in glove with the industry that can drive this change and support organizations in the new landscape. I wonder as well whether you think this might be an opportunity for the workplace profession, those individuals that are sitting within organizations as their leadership teams go, well, how are we going to work in the future? How are we going to do something in the future? And actually, this is our chance, is it not, for the workplace professional to say, look, this is what I do. I can blend all these bits together. I can bring the design elements together. I can bring the ways of working together. I can work with our service providers and make sure we're safe and all the rest of it. You know, do you see this as an opportunity, and response to some of the questions we're getting, just some advice about how we might do that and how we might help lead organizations who might need to think about different work arrangements for the workforce?
I think, you know, ultimately the point is that, you know, we keep saying, oh yeah, there's all these different ways of working. You know, I think we're up to about 12 different ways that have actually been identified over the years. And I think, you know, it's, you know, when we go back to people suggesting that we might go back to cubicles, I think, as always, we need to get that balance right. You know, we talk about people working in 4 different ways, and the communicating, concentrating, contemplating and collaborating. And I think it's time to look at the workplace now, in light of what's going on, to say actually what activities do we want to take place in the workplace in certain areas. If, for instance, somebody is coming into the workplace, sticking the headphones on and not speaking to anybody all day, and that does happen in many workplaces still, why are they sat in an office? Why are they not actually working at home? And I think it's almost this element of presenteeism and the culture change that needs to happen around the ways of working. Ultimately, people need to start being put first. I think as an industry, when you look at you know, the past, I guess, IWFM report around embracing technology in FM, you look at that and you think, you know, as an industry, we need to really start embracing the technologies that are out there. You know, the things that we've been working on, even in the last, you know, couple of months, that are now becoming so relevant because of COVID. It's time for the industry to start looking at them technologies and almost saying, look, this is the value that FM is going to bring to this situation, because we can work with HR, we can work with IT, and, you know, as operations and facilities ourselves, we do have value to add it. I guess there's a lot of risks that come with the current situation as well. I think, you know, the people that have, you know, almost rolled out remote working instantly on a little bit of a, you know, a fag packet. It could be that them organisations now turn around and say, this is why we don't do remote working, it's not working for us. And actually, instead of looking at the tools and technologies that they needed to have in the first place, they're going to almost use this as a bit of a scapegoat to say to people, no, you need to be back in the office. And I think it's up to people now to really kind of push back and look, you know, almost do the what's worked and what's not worked kind of scenarios, and really dig deeper, apart from, like, you know, getting to the superficial layer, but really looking at about what's going on under the surface. And you can only really get that by engaging and asking your people. And I think it's time now that the organisations, you know, took that point from the people of, you know, actually as an individual, what has worked. And I think this is where, you know, so many companies are launching different surveys, left, right, and centre. And I think they are important to get, you know, to capture that feedback to determine what the future way of working is going to be. But I think ultimately the best way of working for me is that it's not dictated by the organisation, but it's dictated by the person. I think, you know, the person should be waking up in the morning and going, this is how I want to work today, this is where I'm going to work today. You know, I think that's the best for everybody, because, you know, if the more choice and control the person has got, the better it is for the person, better it is for the organisation. But that comes, obviously, a level of trust that is needed, and the tools and technologies are needed as well.
Thanks for that, Simone. Just looking at the time, we've got about 10 minutes left before we have to wrap up today. So, but I do want to try and squeeze just a couple of more ideas in. And the first one, Jean, I want to ask you a question, kind of with your inclusivity hat on, if that's okay. But so clearly a lot of work's been done in terms of exclusive design in working environments, and in particular, you know, the sort of the latest push has been around neurodiversity, but there's obviously a lot of different things that we need to consider when we're creating working environments for the entire workforce, and for everyone to feel that they can contribute within it. But what the last few months have done is, in effect, has it created another group, this sort of this tag now that we're all become familiar with, this underlying health condition tag. You know, is that going to open up a new chapter in inclusive design? I mean, it might be more about working from in the office or from home, but, you know, even when people come back into the office, if there is a sense that there is still an element of a virus kicking around, and therefore some people feel much safer if they have their own, I mean, we're saying we don't want to go back to cubicles, but they might want their own room potentially to work in. You know, is that going to be the next challenge that we have with creating inclusive environments?
I think it might be, and I think it's something that employers should have been looking at already. I think this diversity of the population, and we all have different needs at different times as well. One of the things that has occurred to me while everyone's been chatting today is that really the serviced office model, where you've got an office for a small unit and everything, that maybe the model of that would change. So, for example, to take my own situation, I don't have a problem going back to the office. I love being in the office and everything, but I am worried about the journey because I have to go on the tube, the packed underground, all the rest of it. And potentially, if I didn't have the facilities at home enabled to that were geared to my needs, my working fashion and everything, so perhaps I'd be in a cramped one-bedroom flat and I'd got children running around and things like that, I would want somewhere locally that I could go that had a desk and a reasonable space to work, but maybe I didn't have that travel. So I think, you know, there will be all types of environments, and as Simone said, it should be about choice. It should be about waking up in the morning and thinking, you know, am I up to the journey today for some people, or do I need to go to the office today, or am I wasting use of that desk space and someone else could have it and I could just work from home because I don't need that connectivity, and so on. And also thinking about their own, that it's okay to feel my mental health perhaps isn't feeling so good today and I need to be around other people, and that's as good a reason as having meetings for going to the office as well. So I think we need to cater for everything, but I do think there might be a new hybrid model around the serviced office offer, that it could be just, you know, pods there that would answer some of these questions about the actual journey, which for many people is a higher risk element.
And I guess just to add to that as well, you know, sort of what questions literally just popped up here as someone was listening, is that, you know, people's view of agile is slightly different. You know, some organizations, you know, you can't even book a desk, you sort of come up and tip up and sit in, whereas some organizations will have bookable desks. But if people are making decisions, you know, almost on the day themselves, and you know, but they've booked somewhere, you get into sort of some sort of fairly difficult logistical challenges, don't you, with when you're not quite sure what workforce is going to be in there at any one day. And is that just going to be something we're going to have to get used to and figure out, or do you not see that problem occurring?
I do see that problem occurring. I think it occurs already, where we've got open plan offices and people can book the desk or just turn up on the day, and then you see them wandering around with a laptop trying to find somewhere to sit. So I think you've got to have a number of areas that are not bookable that will allow for that flexibility, but it's really difficult. And basically, designers need to have that engagement with the companies they're working for to make sure those figures are right in the first place. And when you get something like COVID, of course, it's a complete game changer. So, for example, I was thinking as we were talking that, you know, if the plans for a vaccine are in place for the end of the year, how much of this is all going to go away, and will everyone go back to how they were? I hope not. I hope we'll have more flexible and more agile, if that's the right term, coming out of it, and more consideration about the individual needs to make sure people are happier and more productive in whatever way works for them, because we are all different.
Absolutely. Steve, just a very particular question for yourself. We've talked a bit about, you know, unoccupied buildings and some of the bits that you've recommended in there. Just as a point of clarity, because I don't know the answer to this, but if you're in a multi-tenanted building, of course, then you've got the landlord will be looking at some aspects of it. So, you know, how do you approach that? I mean, is it relatively similar? Do you know, is it the same thing, or do you know, is it based? Would it be on a landlord by landlord basis? How are people approaching that side of things?
I'll be honest, I don't know in a lot of detail. It does depend really on the nature of how the building is configured. If you're looking at a multi-tenanted building, if you're talking in consideration of turning down systems, that can be quite difficult, especially if they're shared. And also, you do get in cases in multi-tenanted building where there are specific plants that are installed specifically for various tenants, depending on the nature of their operation. So it can be quite difficult, and it is very much on a case-by-case basis in terms of how you address that. if you're talking in relation to the social distancing and the sharing of systems, for instance, air conditioning systems or air circulation systems. I think that I've already put some guidance out in a note in terms of where we're at with air systems and how air systems should be treated. And there's some interesting information that's come from Rehab, which is the European equivalent of BISA, and also from CIBSE in terms of how buildings should be well ventilated and have cross ventilation during these times, until such a time that we know more about the implications of COVID-19.
Absolutely. And Andrew, I think I'm going to leave the last question to yourself, because there's something that you said right at the start of this about relationships, and some of the questions that are coming in are kind of talking about, where does responsibility lie? You know, if we've got to provide everyone with the I don't know, whether it's face masks or gloves or anything like that, where does the responsibility lie? And all that, what that's starting me to wonder is that, are we about to enter a period where, I mean, it sounds like you've got some great relationships with your clients, but you know, I suspect that's not the same everywhere, where there's this sort of adversarial kind of sorting out of, almost on a contractual basis, where does liability lie? What am I responsible for? What are you responsible for? And if because everything's so unknown at the moment, inevitably there's going to be a bit of hammering of that out. So what do you think, I guess in summary, you think that the challenges that organizations and their service providers are going to face, and what advice would you give them to try not to go down a fairly adversarial tone?
I think ultimately, with all risks, we have to consider the risky environment that we're putting our staff into. That's the whole point of a risk assessment at this stage. So, you know, whether you're having your own staff members climb a ladder or, you know, or whatever, it's not that different to that scenario. So actually, a lot of the emphasis is on us as service providers to make sure that we analyse the spaces that we're sending our staff into. Now, we're talking a lot about office spaces today, but if you consider hospitals and rail and all sorts of schools and things, there's a lot more places where there's a lot more density of staff than you have in offices, and a lot more people as well. So I think it's there's a big emphasis on us. Similarly with PPE and things, I don't work in many environments where the client provides PPE to our own staff that go in there. So again, that's on us as the employer when we do our risk assessment to make sure that we have the right PPE and we're giving our staff the right tools to go into these environments as well. But just in terms of making sure it doesn't become a negative relationship, it's just about being proactive and about engaging. And the role of the senior managers that are on this call today is actually about making sure you're interacting with your client at that strategic level right now, rather than down in the weeds. This is actually talking about the strategy of that organization and how they're going to use their workspace, and how we as service providers can adapt what we do to make sure it best fits their organization. And doing that proactively and doing that with high levels of engagement, that's absolutely the key for what we need to do.
Well, thanks, Andrew. And that finishes our hour of questions, which I've got to admit has flown by. So I guess all that's left for me to do is to thank our panelists. So thank you, Simone, Jean, Andrew, and Steve, for bringing your expertise and your candid views on what and how we navigate some of these challenges. I'd like to thank everyone that submitted questions and apologise. I couldn't get to them all. There's been loads. We've got over 300 people live on this at the moment, and as you can imagine, lots of questions coming in, not just here, but we've had some questions on Twitter as well. So I've done my level best to get to all of them, but hopefully, even if I didn't ask your specific question, there was one that kind of was in the right area and you were able to use. So the last thing for me to do is just to point you towards some resources. I've just got to say to you, by the way, my team created loads of amazing slides to use throughout this. I've just flicked through them and I completely forgot about them and didn't use them. So my post-event appraisal will be interesting. But this is one here. We've got a load of advice and guidance that you can access through our insights section of our website. And we've got a specific page set up for COVID-19 advice. And key your eye out for the next episodes of this. As I said, this is a webinar series. It's fortnightly. The next one will be looking at those in the front line. So we'll be getting some experiences from people who are out there doing this. We'll also we'll have one for World FM Day, which is on the 13th of May. So just keep an eye out for these things. They're very popular, and the more of you that can join us, the better. And just as a reminder, this recording will be online, so keep an eye out for that, with a video and a little bit of a summary about what we were talking about as well. So that's all from us. I just want to say thank you again to the panel. Thanks for joining us, guys, and everyone stay safe and speak to you soon.